Nicolás Maduro is gone. 7 million Venezuelans are also not in their country. Yet somehow, some of the loudest voices today are not asking what happened to his people, but whether removing him violated the sensibilities of those who never had to suffer under his rule.
The most important principle of the rule of law that supports everything, the very reason we have law is to have an alternative to lawlessness and violence, for people taking matters into their own hands, using physical force to get their way. We have a neutral set of principles.
This should tell us almost everything that we need to know about the modern West and how we think about power, morality and responsibility. The first reaction across much of Europe, particularly in Germany, was not analysis but a reflex. Before timelines were even clarified, before facts were assembled, and before any responsibility was even discussed, the language arrived fully formed. It is a violation of international law, an imperialist aggression, not spoken out aloud, but the sentiment is that this might be the end of a rules-based world order. All of this tells us very little about Venezuela itself, but it tells us a great deal about us. What so many critics in America and abroad across the pond condemned was not primarily the event itself, because most of them barely knew any of the details. But instead they felt the rupture that it caused in their comforting narrative. It is the belief that the world can be governed by rules, observed by all, and enforced by some institution rather than pure power.
The world thrives on peace, on harmony, on a well-ordered system where treaties matter.
This response isn't really analytical, it's defensive. It assumes and dreams that a neutral global policeman exists beyond national interests. It assumes that the use of force is inherently illegitimate, regardless of context or consequence. Quite ironic, considering the reason why they hold these views to begin with is because of a historical show of force by America nonetheless.
Think about it. The US has been trying since 1945 to support peace in the world through the United Nations. That's why the UN exists.
Regardless, moral condemnation does not alter empirical reality. It only shields the one that condemns it from having to confront it. In the early hours of the 3rd of January 2026, the United States launched a major military operation. Unlike the Russian one, this one went over quite smoothly. The operation was called Absolute Resolve and was carried out against the sitting Venezuelan president Nicolás Maduro. Using airstrikes and special forces, the US troops captured Maduro and his wife. President Donald Trump publicly confirmed that the United States had taken control of key national leadership structures and stated the US would temporarily run the country until a safe, proper and judicious transition could be arranged, explicitly citing stabilization and oil infrastructure. This is something that is widely celebrated in Venezuela and somehow condemned outside of it. The US government reported, thus far, no US fatalities and described the operation as the result of months of preparation. This was not just a symbolic raid, it was a decisive military decapitation of an entrenched autocrat who had resisted diplomatic pressure, sanctions, negotiations and internal reform for years. We should take a closer look at Venezuela under Maduro's rule, as any condemnation of this operation collapses unless one answers a prior question honestly. What exactly was Maduro even governing? Because Venezuela under Maduro was not a flawed democracy, it was not an authoritarian but functional state, it was not a legitimate sovereign temporarily under strain. It was a regime that converted state power into a system of coercion and oppression against its own population. We can clearly see this, as between 2014 and 2025 approximately 7.7 to 7.9 million Venezuelans fled their country. That places Venezuela among the largest displacement crises on Earth, outside of active war zones. This cannot only be explained by the sanctions alone. Sanctions don't really force families to abandon their homes on this scale. They don't erase food networks or turn survival into a daily gamble. People flee in such numbers when the state itself becomes hostile to life. Mass flight is not a side effect, but it is evidence of Maduro's crimes. As the United Nations fact-finding mission on Venezuela documented consistent patterns of extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention and torture, as well as inhuman treatment, even of minors, political persecution, and much more. These were not isolated abuses, they followed chains of command, and involved coordination between security forces, intelligence services, and even criminal elements that were working in conjunction with the state. Human Rights Watch corroborated these findings, particularly after the 2024 election, documenting killings and mass arrests tied directly to political repression. Amnesty International detailed the role of the elite police units operating in poor neighborhoods, where lethal force functioned not as law, but as population control. None of this was really an overreach or error, it was policy willingly put in place. Under Maduro, Venezuela experienced one of the most severe peacetime economic collapses in modern history, maybe the biggest. Hyperinflation erased wages and savings, food shortages became structural, hospitals lacked electricity, antibiotics, and basic equipment, child malnutrition rose sharply. Thank God they made reporting on it illegal, otherwise I would have had numbers here to show you. All of this occurred in a country with some of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. There was no war, no natural catastrophe, and no unavoidable external shock. There was, however, corruption, mismanagement, if one might call it that, and an elite extraction of all wealth in the country. Food programs and access to medicine were politicized, loyalty became a prerequisite for survival, and scarcity was not merely endured, it was administered for this very reason. This is a very classic authoritarian method, by the way: create dependence and then enforce it through obedience and force. In 2020, the United States Department of Justice indicted Maduro and senior officials on charges including narco-terrorism, alleging cooperation with drug trafficking networks. Regardless of the final judicial outcomes of the trial, the structural reality was already visible. Courts lost their independence, the military served regime survival, and illicit economies intertwined with political power. At that point, sovereignty becomes just a shell concept. A state that cannot distinguish law from loyalty has forfeited the moral substance of non-intervention. The final nail in the coffin for my verdict here is the suppression of political alternatives. Opposition figures were arrested, exiled, disqualified, or silenced. Elections were managed and constrained or stripped of their credibility. Independent media was crushed or coerced. It's not really stability, it is just fear management. A regime that cannot tolerate competition understands its own illegitimacy. The sad truth is that sovereignty is always conditional. It isn't a metaphysical concept, it is a functional one. A regime that systemically represses its own population, destroys economic viability, weaponizes scarcity and enforces it, criminalizes institutions and drives millions into exile, has already violated its ethical basis of non-intervention. Invoking sovereignty in its defense is not a principled restraint, it is procedural cowardice, something that we do love here in Europe. I wonder if the same people would cry out for an involvement of the Allies in the Second World War now, or if that was the good intervention, whereas this one is clearly immoral because the Orange Man did it. And thus we should take a very good look at all the critics, all the world leaders that condemned the operation. Brazil denounced it, France moralized, as they always do, China invoked non-interference, Europe demanded adherence to international law. God, do we love that word. Yet all these condemnations share three fatal flaws. The first one is the blindness to reality. They treat Maduro's regime as a legitimate sovereign authority.
We don't allow people to beat each other up to get what they want. We don't allow countries to use the equivalent violence amongst themselves to get ahead in the world.
Rather than an illicit coercive apparatus, oppressing its own citizens and killing them. The second part is the confusion of law with power.
The world thrives on peace, on harmony, on a well-ordered system where treaties matter.
They assume legality equals legitimacy, ignoring that international law has no enforcement mechanism independent of power, and the closest enforcement mechanism that you have is the United States. And the third one is the projection of fear. They are less concerned really with the Venezuelans at all. They are more so frightened about what this event reveals about their own impotence.
That's why after the worst disorder of all time, the Second World War, the UN Charter was instituted. It has a core principle prohibiting the use of military force with very narrow limitations for self-defense.
Which brings me to the myth of the neutral West. Europe believes that it stands above power politics. It really doesn't. And we know that it doesn't, because even the European Union itself is regularly hampered and slowed down by bureaucratic bickering of the individual powers inside of it. The deeper problem is, however, ideological. If liberal values are to exist beyond rhetoric, They require material capacity to enforce them. That capacity doesn't really reside in Brussels or Berlin. It is why the outrage feels so pathetic. We point at the rules, screaming how it is forbidden, while China clearly acknowledges, yes, this is an imperial hegemonic assertion. Very true. The contrast of this makes it very clear that the European outrage is not really clarity but just insecurity. Maduro, however, dared the world to act. He declared emergencies, activated defenses and refused to negotiate exits. In fact, he's even on video inviting Americans to come by.
Señor cobarde, no se meta con el hombre de a pie. Venga por mí. Aquí lo espero en Miraflores. No se tarde en llegar, cobarde.
And Delta Force obliged him. The resistance and the theater around it, without the capacity to actually follow through, is not really resistance, it is provocation. The personal and political bickering, the assertion of might and power, of empire, is really the kryptonite of the rules-based order. It is a myth versus a mechanism. The rules-based order that we love to espouse here in Europe is not really self-executing. There's no global police force. Maybe you could argue there's a world hegemon, but there will never be enforcement without power. Rules without enforcement don't really order anything. They are just narrative. A wishful thinking, you could say. The opposition to this is force doctrine. It is the uncomfortable bedrock of human existence, and maybe even beyond that. Norms and rules work only when violations are punished. Traffic laws without police are just suggestions. International law without any reinforcement is just an aspiration, a daydream of the civilized world. When institutions fail, capability acts. This outcome is really a victory for the free world, and not really a catastrophe. It is a victory for American imperialism for sure, but can you muster a proper argument why it is wrong? Long before America put its gaze at Venezuela, China and Russia were already eyeing it, and surely not for altruistic reasons, it was for the same reasons, the gigantic oil reserves. America's casus belli, the reason for its attack, being that Venezuela acted as a major drug trafficking hub. This operation was bold and controversial, but it was also successful. Maduro is off the board. A kleptocratic regime has been ruptured. A population long trapped under coercion and the oppressive boot of the state has now an opening for freedom, maybe uncertain, but it's better than the boot. Those who denounce this as imperialism without distinction equate discomfort with wrongdoing. History does not, however. History judges regimes by what they did while they ruled, and by this very standard, Venezuela under Maduro forfeited neutrality very long ago. The world does not revolve around European anxieties and feelings. The rules-based order is only as real as the power enforcing it, and when rules fail, the people they were meant to protect, force, not condemnation, becomes the instrument of change. That is not barbarism, it's reality. The decision to mark cartels as terrorist organizations created a doorway for offensive intervention, and in doing so, opening the future for maybe a more free and prosperous Venezuela. In this very spirit, good luck to all of you out there.
Okay, as a Venezuelan American, I got some shit to say. My family, my parents, my sister, my extended family, all lost everything. Their work, their savings, their investments, gone. Wiped out by a narco-dictatorship that has held Venezuela in a death grip for over 25 years. The Venezuelan exodus is the second largest displacement crisis on earth after Syria. This regime has jailed hundreds of political prisoners. Thousands have been murdered simply for speaking out. More than a third of the population has fled. 1/3. Our territory, our natural resources, and our institutions have been overrun by hostile foreign powers. Iranian militias, Chinese corporations, Russian intelligence, all exploiting our country with impunity. It has become a launchpad for an authoritarian expansion in the Americas. Venezuela is already invaded. It is held hostage by a narco state, overrun by foreign agents and enemies of democracy, Russians, Iranians, Chinese. all operating freely, weaponizing our land and resources to expand their influence across Latin America. What Maria Corina is calling for, what millions of Venezuelans are praying for, is the support of the only military on earth capable of countering that threat and helping to free our people. This is not imperialism. This is liberation.